I don't usually scare easily, but that night still haunts me. It was a usual Friday. My friend Danny and I were huddled in his room, the glow of the TV illuminating our faces as we lost ourselves in another round of Call of Duty. It was late, probably after midnight, when we heard a sound, a faint, rhythmic scraping sound coming from outside. We completely ignored it first. Danny said it was probably sound of wind, but the sound didn't stop. It got louder, more deliberate. It wasn't the kind of noise you could ignore. We paused the game and sat there in silence, straining to hear. That's when we caught the distinct crunch of gravel, like someone walking just outside the house. Our first thought was a break-in. Danny's parents were out of town, so it was just the two of us in the house. Grabbing a flashlight, we decided to check it out. Looking back, I don't know what we were thinking. Two scrawny teenagers with nothing but a phone and a lot of adrenaline. We crept to the back door, unlocked it as quietly as we could, and stepped out into the chilly night air. The backyard was eerily quiet. Nothing seemed odd. We scanned the yard with the flashlight, and that's when we saw him just beyond the tree line. A man dressed entirely in black, standing still as a statue. He wasn't looking at us, but the way he stood, with his head tilted slightly to the side, gave me goosebumps. Danny whispered, "Do you see him?" I nodded, too afraid to speak. We ducked back inside and called 911, whispering our story to the dispatcher. It felt like hours before the police arrived, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. But when they checked the woods, the man was gone. No footprints, no sign anyone had been there. We tried to forget it off as a one-time thing, but that night, it was only the beginning. A few weeks later, Danny suddenly called me, panicked. Someone had been banging on his house, late at night, and when he looked outside, he swore he saw a face peeking over the backyard fence. It was the same guy, black clothes, motionless. I stayed over the next night, thinking maybe it was just Danny's imagination running wild. But sure enough, we heard it too. Loud, deliberate banging against the back of the house, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps retreating. We barricaded ourselves in his room, armed with a baseball bat and a kitchen knife, waiting for any sign of movement outside. Once again, we called the police, and once again, they found nothing. No one, no footprints, no explanation. To this day, we don't know who he was or what he wanted. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I think I hear it again, that faint scraping sound, like someone just outside, waiting. You know, I've never been the type to spook easily. I've spent nights camping in the woods, walking home alone in the dark, and even watched my fair share of scary movies without flinching. But there's one night I can't forget, the night I stayed at Kyle's house. It was supposed to be just another sleepover. We'd had plenty before, and they were always the same: video games, junk food, and staying up way too late. That night started no differently. I got to his house around 7 p.m. His parents had already left for their trip, and it was just us. Kyle lived in a quiet neighborhood. You know the type, rows of houses with neatly trimmed lawns, porch lights glowing faintly, and that eerie kind of silence that feels too perfect. By the time we were deep into our gaming marathon, it was nearing midnight, and the neighborhood felt even quieter. Too quiet, if that makes sense. I remember leaning back on the couch after a tough match, laughing at something stupid Kyle had said, when I noticed it. A shift. The air in the house felt heavier, like the walls were closing in just a little. I brushed it off. Maybe I was just tired. But then, the noises started. At first, they were small, almost unnoticeable. A faint creak in the floorboards, a soft thud from upstairs. Probably the house settling, I told myself. Kyle must have thought the same because he barely reacted. Then, another sound, closer this time. A soft, deliberate tap, like someone testing the floor with their foot. Kyle chuckled nervously. "Guess the house is haunted," he joked. I tried to laugh, but my throat felt tight. "What about your dog?" I asked, more to reassure myself than anything else. But then Kyle froze. "Dude," he said quietly, "you know my dog's at the kennel." That's when the air changed again. The joking stopped. The noises didn't go away. In fact, they got louder, more distinct. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving above us. Kyle grabbed the remote and muted the TV. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of those steps. "Stay here," Kyle whispered, standing up. "Like how I'm staying here alone," I hissed back. We looked around for something, anything, to defend ourselves. Kyle grabbed a broomstick, and I ended up with a tennis racket. It wasn't much, but it made us feel a little less helpless. We moved toward the stairs, our footsteps barely making a sound on the carpet. Every creak from the house felt like a gunshot in the stillness. When we got to the top, Kyle motioned toward the hallway. The guest room door was ajar, just enough for us to see the faint glow of a street lamp through the window. At first, it looked normal, but then I saw it, a shadow. No, not a shadow. A person. They were crouched under the window, partly hidden in the dim light. I felt my chest tighten, my breath catching in my throat. I could barely whisper, "Kyle." The figure moved, their head tilted, just enough to make it clear. They knew we were watching. We ran. No hesitation, no second thoughts, just pure adrenaline. We didn't stop until we were across the street, the cold night air hitting our faces like a wake-up call. Kyle fumbled with his phone, dialing 911 while I kept looking back at the house, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway. The police came quickly, flashing lights and all. They searched the house, but the guy was gone. They told us it was probably just a prowler, someone who ran off when we left. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. While we stood outside, talking to one of the officers, something caught my eye. A tall man in dark clothes slipped out of the backyard, vanishing into the shadows before I could even yell. "There!" I shouted, pointing. The officer took off, but it was no use. The guy was long gone. Inside, it was worse than we thought. Drawers were yanked open, clothes scattered everywhere, and Kyle's mom's jewelry was missing. Electronics were unplugged, and the cash his dad kept in the kitchen drawer was gone. One officer turned to us and said, "You're lucky. If you'd gone into that room, things could have been a lot worse." To this day, I can't stop thinking about it. What if we hadn't noticed him in the window? Or worse, what if he noticed us first? I've always loved the idea of camping. There's something about the open air, the sounds of nature, and the flicker of a campfire that just feels freeing. Growing up, my best friend Tyler and I would talk for hours about how we'd one day venture deep into the woods, setting up camp far from civilization. But, as kids, our parents weren't exactly thrilled about the idea of two 12-year-olds disappearing into the wilderness alone. So, we found a compromise: backyard camping. It wasn't exactly the great outdoors, but Tyler's backyard was big enough to feel like an adventure. It backed right up to a dense forest, separated only by a tall, weathered wooden fence. That night, we were thrilled. We pitched the tent right at the edge of the yard, so close to the fence that the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch across the fabric of the tent. The plan was simple: stay up late, eat too many snacks, and freak each other out with ghost stories. By midnight, though, the excitement had worn off. The night had settled in, cool and quiet, with only the sound of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves to remind us we were outside. I was half asleep, the kind of drowsy where reality starts to blur with dreams, when something pulled me back to consciousness. At first, I didn't know what had woken me. I just lay there, staring at the dark ceiling of the tent, my heart beating a little faster than it should have been. Then, I heard it, a sound, a slow, rhythmic creaking, like wood bending under pressure. I froze, straining to listen. The sound was faint, but it was there, steady and deliberate. My pulse quickened as I sat up, glancing over at Tyler. He was still out cold, his face buried in his sleeping bag. I moved as quietly as I could, unzipping the tent just enough to peek outside. The yard was bathed in pale moonlight, every blade of grass and shadow illuminated just enough to look wrong. At first glance, everything seemed normal. But then, my eyes landed on the fence. Someone was leaning against it. I blinked, thinking maybe I was imagining it. The figure was tall, their body pressed against the wooden slats, moving slowly, like they were testing the strength of the fence. For a moment, I thought it might just be a branch swaying in the breeze, but then they shifted. It wasn't a branch. I ducked back into the tent, shaking Tyler awake with more force than I intended. "Tyler," I whispered urgently, "there's someone out there." He groaned, still half asleep, until he caught the panic in my voice. "What are you talking about?" he mumbled, sitting up. "Just look," I hissed. He grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent, peeking outside. The beam of light scanned the yard, shaky in his trembling hand. By the time he pointed it toward the fence, the figure was gone. Tyler turned to me, his face pale. "Let's just stay in here," he whispered. We zipped the tent back up and sat back to back, clutching the flashlight like it was the only thing keeping us safe. The seconds dragged on, feeling like hours. The crickets had gone silent, and the only sound left was the faint rustling of leaves. Just when I started to think maybe we'd imagined it, the sound of footsteps shattered the silence. They were close, too close. I could feel Tyler stiffen beside me, his breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. He grabbed my arm, his nails digging into my skin. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Before I could answer, it happened. A shadow loomed against the thin fabric of the tent. It was unmistakable. Someone was standing just feet away from us. Tyler screamed, a high-pitched, panic sound that made my heart leap into my throat. We didn't wait to see who or what it was. We bolted. I don't even remember unzipping the tent. 1 second we were inside, and the next, we were sprinting across the yard, our feet barely touching the ground. We reached the house, slammed the back door shut, and locked it behind us. We spent the rest of the night huddled in Tyler's room, every light in the house turned on. The creaking sound came back a few times, faint and far away, but whenever we looked out the window, the yard was empty. The next morning, we went back out to check the tent. The zipper was still open, and everything inside had been scattered. One of the tent poles was broken, like someone had stepped on it. To this day, I don't know who or what was leaning on that fence. But one thing's for sure, I haven't gone backyard camping since.